Let's make this kind of official. What is it? If you would please state your name, your date of birth, and the location where we are for the camera.
I am Robert Wrigley. I was born February 27th, 1951. We are sitting in my little studio building, which is called Stanza, one of the two Italian words, the lesser Italian word for room, on Moscow Mountain, not far, 6 miles north of Moscow, Idaho.
Okay. And how long have you been writing in this spot?
I built this building in 2002, so 11 years in this space.
Okay. So here's the sort of quick and dirty questions. But what genres do you work in?
Well, poetry almost exclusively. Every now and then I'm sort of forced to commit prose, like a craft lecture or something, and I've got a bunch of those that someday people keep telling me I should make a book out of, but mostly I'm not interested. I'd rather write poems.
Yeah. Okay, so what kind of devices do you own or have access to for your writing?
Meaning electronic devices.
Either or.
Well, I mean, most fundamentally, of course, is the computer. I have one laptop. That's my private computer, which sometimes I compose on. Always I compose prose on the computer. I can't imagine being a prose writer and writing in longhand, but some people do. Beyond that, I have pencils and pens and notebooks.
Okay. Do you? What's your operating system? What type of device do you use?
I have a Mac. What is it? A MacBook Air. Okay. And I no longer have an external hard drive. Back when I had a PC, I had an external hard drive where I backed up everything from the hard drive of the computer onto an external drive. Now I put things into the cloud, the iCloud. I back stuff up on Mozy.
Okay.
Just to keep track. Theoretically, at least, I've never had to go retrieve anything, but theoretically, it's safe out there.
Yes. Yeah, that is definitely some of the questions. Do you work on a device at the university at all, or is there just the one device? Do you ever move things from one device to the other?
No, I try to keep what I write, the poems themselves, away from university machines. Just because the university owns the machine, and I really don't want anything that I own on that university machine.
Right. So how do you save your pre-writing or your notes?
I print off a lot of things. There's a pile of drafts back here that, in fact, need to be moved to a box, but I haven't brought the new box out from the house. And it takes me, usually a box will take 2 years to fill, and then it goes into storage in the basement until somebody offers me enough money for it, and then they can have all the boxes.
All the boxes. So do you save the drafts of your individual works as you go along? Do you save it like as one poem, or do you put them all together, or do you save over?
I don't put them all together. It seems to me that it would probably be a good idea to do something like that. And if I were to do something like that, if someone comes along and wants my papers, they would be a lot happier if I had them organized in some way. But basically the pile, which is not very evenly stacked, is pretty much the way they go into the box. So that I will work on a poem, print off a draft, put a date on it and a number. Let's see. Just pulling the one off the top. This is a little draft of a poem called Goodbye to the River, which I have no memory of. But this draft was composed on the 15th of October, 2013, and it's draft number 2. So I do have a sort of.
So you do have a system.
I have a system, and I suppose if someone were really interested and were to go through the boxes, which ultimately have a year on them, or a period of years on them, if it takes me a while to fill one, someone could go through and actually find the poems under a certain title, and put them in order, in the order in which they came into being.
Okay. That's a kind of,
Although sometimes I change titles, so I don't know what that does to the that's just going to cross people. Well, it will keep said researcher, should he or she ever exist, busy.
Yes.
well through tenure.
Yeah. So okay, so you were just saying you back up you back up your work by using a Mozy folder,
Hmm.
which backs up your work to the server. Um, and all your poems are in one location. How do you save a work that's been published? Do you put it in a different place? Do you?
I do. I have this, which is sort of the in process folder,
Okay.
little Thesis Binder they're called at Harvard. Um, and there's in the back go all the poems that have been published with the name of the magazine on it, and in front are the ones that are still in progress.
Okay. Have you ever? This is a general question. But have you ever received or sought out information about methods for kind of best practices for digital archiving?
I never have,
Okay.
and probably I should. I talked to Daniel Orozco a lot,
Uh-huh.
who is so frightened of losing things that he backs everything up on a jump drive. I think maybe two. He uses Mozy. He uses one other backup service as well. Prints things. I mean, he's anal about it, and I can't really blame him. He's a prose writer, though. They lose.
Right.
You lose a file there, you could lose hundreds of pages.
Right. Right. No, I think that was one of the interesting things we saw was that there were a lot of, not maybe to Orozco's extent, but of people who would do that. But then the issue becomes for them a lot of times is what's what and which version is which, and the kind of mess of that. And like, I mean, you think your files will be difficult. His files will be, because there's not a date on them, there's no handwriting, there's no indication. It's
Right.
just going to be kind of like, what?
Right. Well, and I tried to use, you know how when you save something in, say, Microsoft Word,
Yeah.
when you save it, it gives you a date, but then you resave it, you modify it, you resave it, and it's a completely new date, so the old date goes away. So, I found that I couldn't rely on that at all. I had to put a penciled date or a pen date on the corner of the draft, just so I knew which was which and when was what.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like that's kind of the.
And I think that's important. I don't know that that's important. Whereas in the notebook, it starts with a date, and every page is dated. So I know exactly, if I can go back into the notebooks, which I do with some regularity, just to sift through and see if I missed anything, if there's some piece that I might resurrect and make use of. I know exactly when I first put it down.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so that was sort of the precursor, although it's basically the same questions are coming back. But this is going to be kind of more overarching on your practice over time. So how long have you been writing professionally, in which I mean something that's sort of either your main focus or something that's supporting you financially?
Well, really, I guess I would say since 1972.
Okay.
Which was when I was, in fact, an undergraduate student. I got discharged from the Army in 1971, got drafted, went back to college, and within a matter of a few months was waylaid by poetry. I didn't want to be a poet. I never really had a whole lot of use for poetry.
Uh-huh.
I took the class on a kind of lark, thinking, how hard can it be? Doesn't have to go very far across the page. As far as I could tell, it doesn't have to rhyme anymore. You don't have to have any kind of regular meter. And as far as I could tell, most people couldn't figure out what it meant. Anyway, so I can do that. I can get 3 credits that way. Well, I walked into the class and I got absolutely waylaid, and that was 1972, which was 41 years ago.
And where was that?
Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville.
And who was that first? Who was your first professor?
My first poetry professor was a man by the name of Clyde Fixmer, who's still alive, pushing 80, was really kind of a failed poet. I'd never want him to hear me say that, of course, but he's published, I think, 2 or 3 books, and they've all been self-published.
Yeah.
He never really had the belly for the getting out into the, I don't know what else you call it, the marketplace, the literary world. He couldn't bear rejection. And I figured out early on, as far as I knew for a long time, rejection was like that's what happened.
Yeah.
Although the first poem I ever sent out got accepted. Our first batch of poems I ever sent out, I got something accepted. So I got like hooked on that part of it too.
Yeah.
But publication, as you know, publication is not the same thing as writing. They may be almost entirely unrelated.
Yes. So that kind of gets us started, but I mean, the next question is sort of like, could you give a sort of general description of the arc of your career, starting with this portion versus the next? Push this one more time.
Does that automatically take pictures, or?
No, this is recording. I'm going to do it twice. It just stops because it fills up really fast. But it's a higher resolution thing, and then this one is. Sorry. So get back to sort of the general brief, or not the large arc of your career, and how that's kind of taken you through the scene.
Well, I mean, I'm a product of the the creative writing industry. I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to write novels. I wanted to write novels that sold a lot of copies, made me a lot of money. I wanted to live in the south of France. I'm serious about this, Devin. You have to. I mean, as serious as say a 21-year-old could have been. I wanted to drive an Aston Martin and live in the south of France and date supermodels. It seemed like a perfectly appropriate and maybe even attainable career goal. I was an idiot. I didn't know anything. But then I got waylaid by poetry, and I think that I discovered or realized that whatever sort of disposition I have is suited to poetry, and not so much to prose, and certainly not to fiction. I have in fact published a couple of short stories years ago, 25 years ago, I think was the most recent one. But they never made me happy. It never, not like writing a poem did. So anyway, I got waylaid and got real keen on poetry and began haunting the library of my alma mater in the department of the skinny books, and looked into graduate school and discovered there was this degree called the Master of Fine Arts, of which there were 11 programs in the country that offered that degree in 1972, I think, and one in Canada. Applied to a number of programs, wound up going to Montana, fell in love with living in this part of the world, and really have never stopped in terms of writing, nor of living in this part of the world. So I got kind of waylaid by geography and poetry simultaneously. The arc of my career aesthetically is a completely other kind of thing.
And that this is more just sort of like place, person, kind of general overview of where you were, what happened.
Right. Well, when I went to Montana, I got to study with Madeline DeFries, John Haynes, and probably most famously Richard Hugo, and they were, Dick Hugo and Madeline DeFries particularly were just enormously important to me in terms of the craft of poetry. And I don't think my notion of the line is, for me, separable from what I learned from, say, Madeline DeFries. Dick was a completely other kind of teacher, but a magnificent teacher. He could make you see what you were doing right and what you were doing wrong with a phrase, and that was a great thing.
And so you went from you were at Montana, and then where did you go next? Was it LCSC or?
I went back to my alma mater, where I was an adjunct for a year and applied for jobs as close to Missoula, Montana as I could find. And the first job that I got was down at LCSC in 1977. I was a sabbatical replacement for a year. But they loved me and tried to immediately make a tenure track position for me, which they offered me, and I turned down because I had an NEA. and I didn't want a job.
Yeah.
But I wound up teaching a couple classes for that year, and then I started tenure track on a job that was really kind of that I held for 22 years. That was not a great job for a poet because the teaching load was 4/4 for a long time. And then somehow I convinced them that I should have a 3/3 load. And then ultimately Kim and I split the job and each taught 2/2, and that was fine. That was great. But then the position opened up here, and the only other place I was really interested or would have been interested in going would have been Montana. But I loved Moscow and I love Idaho, and I'd been here for a long time. So when this job came along, I snapped it up.
And what year was that?
1999 was my first year at U of I.
And how long had the MFA program here been?
I think it was 3 years old then. I think 96 was the first year they admitted students. May have been 97. I can't remember now.
Okay.
So it's still a pretty young program, really.
Yeah. Yeah, but you've been here
For most of it.
Most of it, yeah. And so then you've been here since then, basically in the same position, same job,
Mm-hmm.
and over this time you've written. Can you kind of talk about? You've written like 7 books.
Let's see.
Is it
99, the year I was hired, I published Reign of Snakes. The year I was hired here, I published Reign of Snakes. So since Reign of Snakes, if you count that one, although it was written while I was teaching at LC, so I've published Reign of Snakes, Lives of the Animals, Earthly Meditations, Beautiful Country, and now Anatomy of Melancholy. Five books since I've been at U of I.
Okay. So that's sort of the general overview, and then I'd like to kind of start about your writing process generally. And I've got it kind of broken into 3 portions, one being kind of the compositional spot, so like pre-writing notes, kind of the development of the work, and to its first draft, and then the next being sort of revisional, like how do you revise, etc. We'll talk, and that'll be kind of the next thing, and then the third process being the organizational archival. If that doesn't make sense with your writing process, we can talk about it differently. That's just how I have them.
Well, we'll see.
Here.
See how it goes. It sounds fine to me.
Okay. So when you first started writing, when you were first maybe in Montana and in the first sort of stages of your career, how did you kind of go about writing a poem? How did you kind of get the idea? How did you pre-write? Did you draft, etc.? So that's sort of my first question.
Yeah, I have always, and I don't know where, I have piles of these little fellas, these moleskine, or however one pronounces that, I can never tell. I probably have 250 of these piled somewhere. I think they're in a box in the house. And they're just the places where when I get an idea or an image occurs to me, or a phrase, or I see some phrase, I make a note. I make that first note so that when I come out here or where I go, wherever it was I happen to be doing the writing, anywhere along the way, which was sometimes at a kitchen table, you never knew. Back years ago, I didn't have a space to write in. I had this one or the most recent couple of these to just consult, just to sort of trip on the switch. Sometimes, though, I mean, you exhaust those things, or nothing in the little notebook interests me, so I just come out, and that's why there's this pile of books here on the futon. They are all books I've pulled down, as well as a little pile that I brought back from England. I'll just come out and I'll look at the shelves and pull a book off the shelves almost at random. I mean, sometimes I have no idea what book it is I'm reaching for. It's just something about the color will appeal to me, and I'll open it up, thumb through it, look for a poem or look for a word, a title, a phrase, anything that just turns on a switch, that just gets me started. Mostly it's always seemed to me that the only way I can get started is to just start putting words on paper. So that's when I turn to this notebook. It seems far less effective to me to sit down at the computer and try to begin composing when I don't have anything in particular on my mind.
Right.
Whereas in the notebook itself, you can, or I can doodle, I can write a phrase. I can just sort of noodle around the way the way a musician would noodle around with a musical phrase, to see where it leads me. And I've always believed that writing begets writing, so that the more I noodle around, something eventually is going to interest me. Something eventually is going to find a way to connect with the next thing, the next word, the next phrase, or a kind of move toward an idea. I hate using the word idea, though, talking about poems, because when people always ask things like, and they tend to be people who've never really written before, or who are at the beginning of trying to write, they'll say, where do you get your ideas for poems? And I always want to say, what ideas? Where? Because they tend not to come from ideas. They tend to come from words or phrases or images, or something I've seen outside the window. That's why who was it who was here most recently? I had Hirsch came out here, showed him my space. He sat at the desk and he said, I couldn't write here. All I do is look out the window. Well, it's true. I spend a lot of time looking out the window, but that's just my way of inviting what was outside into the poems. And those kinds of things are what occur to me as language. Somehow the lens of the writing studio, the lens that is my eyes and imagination and language, can convert what it is I see into some kind of a phrase that's useful and I can build with.
Okay. So you move from the Moleskine notebooks into this notebook, which, could you describe what the notebook is? And
yeah, this is what do they call these? This is the Gemstone Collection. And this is mostly what I've been using for the last 20 years. I was teaching at the University of Oregon for a year, and the graduate students bought me one of these, and I loved it so much that I've been buying these ever since. That's when I really start getting movement toward a poem to happen. And it used to be, as I said, that whole poems would happen in those notebooks. Now, it can be a stanza, it can be 20 or 30 or 50 lines if it's a longer thing. When I'll get impatient with the sort of the slowness of the process writing. I always write in pencil, and I'll go to the computer, or I'll get stopped. I won't know where to go. I mean, you know what this is like. You just, okay, what's the next thing that happens in this poem? And I don't know. And somehow converting the handwritten text to text on the computer screen, and it was with a typewriter even before, can allow you to see things about its structure or about its movement that you might not have seen while you were in the midst of it. It's almost like the handwriting became something that swallowed me, and I had to escape from the handwriting and put things down on the computer screen, let's say now, in order to have some sense of what might come next.
And so before you were using the computer, you were using the typewriter in the same similar manner?
Yeah. I had an IBM Selectric. I guess even before that, I had some other kind of electric typewriter. But and I would type it up as far as I could go, and then wait and see what would happen. Usually, what that meant was that it would I take the poem out of the typewriter as far as it went, and write it back down longhand in the notebook, but it would look different. I would have shaped it differently, because looking at it on the screen gives it the appearance more of a kind of permanence, which is dangerous, I think. It would have been dangerous for me in the beginning, I think, to compose on a word processor or a typewriter, because it might have given me this inclination toward a particular kind of structure that, in fact, would not have been as interesting or as evocative to me. Now, I'm perfectly comfortable just looking at lines on the computer screen and saying, "Wait a minute, why are these lines the way they are?" And I'm a compulsive syllable counter, even if ultimately in revisions I wind up excising syllables or adding syllables. I like composing, say, a decasyllabic line, just to force me into manipulating syntax, to keep the right margin mattering, and somehow finding that way of moving the poem down the page.
First, I guess the first question is, when did you start using a computer to do these things? And then secondly, was there anything that changed when you moved from typewriter to computer? Was there a different feeling, a different sort of, I mean, you said a little bit about this.
Yeah, I think that in the beginning, and this probably would have been, let's see, I got my first computer in the fall of 1995. And this was a sort of computer that had which I still have, still works, a compact, a little tiny laptop, as we called them then, that had a minimal hard drive. I think I nearly filled it up. But I think I kind of used it really as just a sort of glorified typewriter with a little screen. It was black and white screen. I mean, there was nothing special as a piece of technology. So I used it as a not so special piece of technology, kind of like a typewriter, except that, you can save it and go back to it and find it just the way you left it, and not have to type it completely in, or not have to go from the typewritten sheet back to the notebook. So there is a kind of step that gets left out. That was the first time I started leaving out the step of writing by hand, then going to the computer, and then going back, or to the typewriter, then going back from the typewritten sheet to longhand. Mm-hmm. In a way, I suppose the best thing I could have, the thing I thought was best about that part of the process when the computer came along, was that it saved time. I could immediately just look at it on the screen, go back to longhand, and then add what I'd written longhand onto whatever I'd already saved on the computer. Okay. But it kept me from writing everything back down, and for a long time I wondered about, well, what am I missing there? What might I not have seen that I would have seen if I'd been writing it longhand? And I used to say things like, the reason I keep writing longhand, or printing actually, I print this stuff, is that it allows me to feel the shapes of the letters themselves. It allows you to dispense words incrementally in syllables, not that the typewriter or the computer is any different, except that it is. You sort of hear the syllables more when you're writing it out longhand, or you certainly feel them more when you're writing longhand. But eventually I began to see that, and I think Kim was part of what helped me see that. She just said, that's just silly. Why would that really change anything? And I thought, well, you're right. It doesn't change much of anything. So I began to be a whole lot more comfortable then with just moving from, in sort of one fell swoop, from the handwritten text to the text on the computer, which I would then print out and then do extensive revisions on, arrows, things crossed out, that sort of thing, whole sections crossed out.
Okay. So I guess we can kind of move into sort of talking about revision generally then, and so you're talking about how you do revision now on the computer, and the differences between you were moving back and forth more with the typewriter. Are the sort of I guess, what were your practices when you first started? I mean, like, how did you kind of learn how to revise?
That's a really good question. I tell the students, the graduate students, that because they hate to revise. I said, you can't hate to revise. You have to love to revise, because that's like most of the job. If you hate to revise, it's like hating writing, because that's really what writing is. And there came and then I like to tell them my own experience, which was that when, in the beginning, as it were, I didn't realize it, but I preferred to have written to writing. I really loved the finished product, or what I perceived as the finished product, which is to say the final, in quotes, draft of a poem. That's the part I loved most. Somewhere along the line, I began to prefer the process to the product, because that's the place where all the excitement happens. That's the place where you surprise yourself, and the process of revision is certainly made so much more fluid and swift with the computer than it ever could have been with writing longhand or and then moving to the computer. It's so easy to drag and drop, to cut and paste with the computer that it's sort of staggering to try to remember what it was like in the beginning. Putting together a book manuscript. Yeah. My first book manuscript that Penguin published, that was all typed on a typewriter without page numbers, which I then penciled in. I thought about winding them all in a typewriter and typing in page numbers, but I thought, this is insane. It'll drive me nuts. So I just had handwritten page numbers on it when I put together that book manuscript. And now, of course, it's just such a breeze that the computer will automatically do all that stuff for you. I don't think that it changes much about the way I compose, but there are some, I think, extraordinary. He's a big bug. Yeah. There's some great advantages about seeing it on the screen in the computer. There's a poem in Anatomy of Melancholy that is it is, let me find it. It's called Earthquake Light. Let's see, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 tercets. Mm-hmm. So it's 24 lines. Originally, in the first draft of this poem, the early drafts of this poem, it was in 6 quatrains. Okay. Not much was different about it. And if you look at it, when it was divided into quatrains, more or less the same structure that it is now, the first quatrain ended with a period. That is to say that the period at the end of what is now line 1 stands at 2. And I looked at it on the page, on the computer screen for a long time before I realized that, wait a minute, I sort of like the idea that the first quatrain ends with a period, which sort of establishes this undeniable hardness of the quatrain as a structural unit. Mm-hmm. But then I thought to myself, what happens if I break this into tercets? Because it's the same number of lines. I can break it into a different number of tercets and still have the poem be comprised of the same number of lines. Yeah. And it changed everything about the poem, having that poem broken into tercets instead of quatrains. And that was so easy to do and so easy to examine, to test with the computer. Just backspace here, space here, return here. Just did that and looked at it and go, okay, bingo. And that sort of thing, I think, is one of the great things that part of the technology of the computer helps to facilitate. It allows you to see those possibilities. Shit, if I'd had to completely retype the thing in tercets, would I have done it? Yeah. Probably, I would have done it, but it would have been a much more arduous thing, and it might not have occurred to me simply because the little voice in my head says, "You don't want to type that again." Right. So that I think is one of the great things about the technology. You sort of, I guess, what sort of mode is your revision? There was a phrase in one of the books I'm reading. What is your primary mode of textual change? This is an English woman. And she was sort of describing sort of T.S. Eliot versus Pound, being T.S. Eliot being the sort of subtractive, and Pound being sort of accretive, and that just more and more. Or there's also a sort of substitutive sort of mode as well. Is it one of those fit your mode, or is it? Oh, I'm subtractive. Okay. Absolutely. I should get, if she weren't so old and weren't taking care of my father 24/7, I would have my mother, who always embroider me a little sampler that I could hang on the wall that says, "Cutting is virtue," because it is. And I think I may be part of the lineage of poets who sometimes can't shut up. I love Dryden. I love Pope, but I can only take them for about 100, 200 lines at a time, and I got to go lie down because they just did not know when to be quiet. They did not know when to shut up. And they didn't have to. And who am I to talk about them that way? Except for the fact that I'll look at even at poems of Pope's and think, if this had been cut by about a third, it would just be a lot more friendly. It would just be a lot less boring, quite honestly. And it may not have been boring. It is not still boring to a lot of people, but I think it's one of the reasons that people like Pope probably aren't as read except by academics as they once might have been, because there's just so much of it. So maybe being sort of in that lineage or of that sort, that, I have people tell me all the time, well, you write long poems. No, I don't. The longest poem I've ever written has been like 400 lines. That's puny.
Yeah.
But I've cut the longest poem in Beautiful Country is 220 some odd lines. It was 800 lines long in early drafts.
Okay.
And most of those, I'd print off a long draft, and then I'd start cutting, and I cut 600 lines.
Which poem is that?
It's called American Fear.
Okay. Is there, when you're revising, do you have is there an intention behind the revision? I mean, and along with that, are you revising towards, is it driven by sound? Is it driven by theme? Is it driven by structure of the poem in general, or by meaning?
Certainly sound figures into it. Basically I'll see or hear opportunities to let the poem go someplace else it might not have gone. Mm-hmm. Basically because I hear a particular sound that appeals to me, or see the possibility of substituting a word in a subsequent line that can pick up that sound. Mm-hmm. I call them sound linkages. Yeah. A lot of people do. I think Ellen Bryant Voigt was the first person I ever heard use that term. But they are, sound is for me a compositional tool. I have something called the rule of the rhyme. When I make a sound that I particularly like or feel is evocative in a line, I'll want to make that sound again within the first 3 or 4 syllables of the subsequent line, just to see where the poem goes, just to see where that sound takes me inside the poem. I've forgotten the original question, how the hell I got here.
Is there an intention behind the revision, or you just sort of follow?
Well, I think in sort of most fundamental way, I'm looking for clarity without clarity, but with a kind of evocative simplicity. I don't want poems to be boilable down to a kind of theme. Yeah. I'm not interested in poems that can be said to be about something. Sure, they're about something, but what they're really about is something much more than that particular something. Yeah. And what I'm looking for is to get at that particular something, not so much the thing as the other thing. Tony Early, the nonfiction writer, talks about all great writing being about the thing and the other thing. Mm-hmm. And it's the other thing that interests me a whole lot more than the thing. In the drafting process, I'm dealing with the thing. In the revision process, when I get seriously down to revision, I'm dealing with the other thing. How can I make what this poem is after? And that what is frequently several different whats. So how can I make those things all work together?
Has your relationship to that sort of idea changed over your course of writing, or has it been sort of has it been somewhat constant in that, or like you just once you heard him talk about it, you're like, oh right, that's what I've been doing.
Hold on, I have to say okay. Ask the question again if you want.
I guess you're talking about the thing and the other thing. Is that something that once he said that to you, you sort of realized that's what you've been doing all along, or is it something that you came to realize, you came to be practicing, and before you were doing something else?
I think it was something I'd been doing all along without really having that sort of a simple way of explaining it or simple way of seeing it. But I was always after that. I mean, I was interviewed by a young woman in Scotland who asked me if I could talk about what she said were my 2 or 3 dominant themes. And I said, I'm sorry, I don't know what those are. And she, told her about and wound up with a long answer talking about my discomfort with the idea of theme. Because it's just a way of sort of circumscribing what the poem is after, drawing a line about what the possibilities of the poem might be, and a line around that. And I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in the poem being as big as it can possibly be, having as many possible readings, if you will, as it can have. Maybe as many possible readings as there are readers.
What role do other people play in the process of your revision? Do they play a role?
Not a whole lot. Kim is my principal reader, and she's knows me so well that she can tell when she needs to be supportive, and can tell when she needs to be mean. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you just need to have a kick in the pants. But she's also big on. She's the one who says, "Okay, here's where you need to open it up, right here, right in this spot." And she's almost invariably correct. Oh yeah, you're right. I need to develop that spot. I need to go somewhere else. I need to bring some other kind of an image, some other kind of a reference. The poem, as Dick Hugo would say, you need to write off the subject in that spot, he would say. I always call it just bring in a Buick, which is just my own figure for it, but that's what I do. Find something extraneous, seemingly extraneous, to bring into the poem so I can open it up here.
Okay. And so you don't send your poems to other writers or have anything like that?
I have a couple of friends that I will send poems to on occasion. Dorianne Lux has looked at poems for me. Henry Carlisle, who lives over in Portland, a wonderful poet. On a couple of occasions, Phil Levine has looked at some things for me, but mostly no. I don't have that kind of network of other writers.
In these sort of more unusual circumstances, what drives you to sort of send a poem outside?
Mm-hmm. Well, it will be a poem that for some reason or another I'm uncertain of. The example that occurs to me is a long sequence of poems called Earthly Meditations, which originally appeared as kind of little prefatory sections in each of the 4 parts, and then a 5th envoy. Sort of the organizing poems in the book Rain of Snakes, which is a very sound-driven, intensely meditative poem that I wrote. I mean, I was on a Guggenheim when I wrote that book, and that was the last poem, that big poem that went into the book, because something was missing. I knew something was missing, but I didn't know what it was. And right in the middle of the book is this other long sequence called Rain of Snakes. Yeah. And I had this one poem, which was actually the first part of Earthly Meditations. I took it in to show it to Kim, and she said, "Okay, this stanza here needs to go. But you might want to consider just writing more of this, see how, because I don't feel like it's done." Mm-hmm. And so I wrote this, it's 500 some odd lines long, this sequence, over the course of 2 weeks. But while I would do it, I would go out and I'd play Dylan Thomas on the CD player, just listen to him say this gorgeous nonsense, as Auden called it. Or I'd read Plath, or I'd read the Book of Nightmares. Mostly, I was, if there's a model for that poem, it was Retke's North American Sequence. Very much nature-driven sort of thing, and highly musical. And then when I finished it, I knew what I wanted to do with it, and use it as sections throughout the book. Actually, that was Kim's idea too. I couldn't write without her. But I mean, I didn't really trust the poem. It was just not like anything else I've ever written. So I sent it to Dorianne and Henry and Phil and a couple of other people just to find out. All of whom, one of whom, Henry, who was a student of Retke's, it was too close to Retke for him.
Okay.
He couldn't really. He didn't want me to do it.
Yeah.
Everybody else said this is the best thing you've ever written. You just got to keep writing more like that. People keep telling me you got to go back and get that voice again and do more. And I keep saying I've already done it. I don't want to do that anymore.
Yeah.
But I did. I do have those people. I haven't used any of them. Henry a couple times since, but that's been about it. I don't really. I have this writer in residence here, so who's extremely helpful.
So you're talking a little bit about. I mean, these are like how this goes into a book and everything. And I guess I'm wondering if you can sort of delineate a difference between how you revise an individual piece and how you revise a collection of works, and maybe talk a little bit about how that has changed over the course of your.
Yeah, it's such an ongoing thing with individual pieces.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times, I'll publish a poem in a magazine and I'll go back in and think, I want to change this, and I'll change something. I'll fiddle with things a little bit. I don't think there's anything particularly holy about the fact that it appeared in print in one way. I can tinker with it. But then I find when I start assembling a book, and I still do this the old-fashioned way. I don't think there's any other way. Is I get all the poems I think might comprise the poem, and I lay them out on the floor. But then that act of laying them out on the floor and finding, say, okay, this batch of 10, 12 poems sort of goes together. You can see there's some connective tissue between them. Then I've got to go back and start making, and I have a system of little arrows and checks and numbers and so forth that show me opportunities to tie those poems together. And if I write as in, say, Anatomy of Melancholy, a book that's in 4 sections, then I have to find a way to connect the sections together. So that the assemblage of the sections is part of the assemblage of the whole, of course, but the assemblage of the whole and the sections therein becomes also the part of the revision of the individual poems, as I find ways to stitch those things together in the larger fabric.
And that has been consistent throughout, you think?
Oh yeah. Certainly from my second book on. My first book, which Copper Canyon published in 1979, was my MFA thesis, basically. And when I find copies in bookstores, I buy them. I'm not embarrassed by it, but boy, it's really beginning work. And I think in the selected poems I used maybe 3 poems, and even then I think I could have left them out. It wouldn't hurt anything. But my editor said, no, you got to have something. Okay. So beginning, though, with the second book, Moon in a Mason Jar, that's been absolutely the way I've operated. It's gotten complicated with 2 of the books. My third book, What My Father Believed, and Beautiful Country, which are volumes not divided into sections. So that each of, it seems more all of a piece somehow, and those required a lot more movement. I don't know how I could have done it without the computer, moving poems in different locations throughout the text, and finding ways to maintain a kind of seamlessness, but not a kind of overwhelming sense of there being an arc, because it is a collection of poems. If there's an arc, it's a very pale arc, at least in those 2 books of mine.
You talked a little bit, well, you just said something about a system of arrows and numbers. I was wondering if you could maybe go into the nitty-gritty of that?
Well, it might be, sometimes it's like, it'll have to do with page numbers. I'll have the draft and I'll put page numbers on, then I'll just have an asterisk and 7, which will mean look for the asterisk on page 7, or a check 118, look at 118. And I'll have another check so that there are a couple spots in a couple of poems that correspond that can allow me to make a stitch here that connects those two things. So across 2 or 50 pages, there's a kind of communication that's going on through the whole of the manuscript.
Yeah. And then how do you then, you just combine them all into one Word document on your computer?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and before then, when it had to be typed up, then it was really hard.
Yeah.
So I had to do a lot of penciling of things in. Somewhere in those many boxes in the closet in the basement are like drafts, worksheets, whatever you want to call them, versions of all of the books since Moon in a Mason Jar that sort of show that process, how that came about.
Yeah. And have you, now that you do use a computer, do you find yourself making any changes to the collection once it's into a bigger file? Or?
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
Okay.
it never really stops. Once I get it in the file, I'm sure I want. Well, Anatomy of Melancholy. I thought I had it exactly the way I wanted it, but the first poem in the published book used to be the last poem in the published book, and the last poem in the published book used to be the first.
Uh-huh.
And I just thought to myself, and they were that way because there's a kind of chronology there. In a way, the last poem in the book happens before the first poem in the book, if you know what I mean. It seems like, so chronologically, it seemed better that what is now the last poem happened first. But I got to working on it and realizing, and a lot of it had to do with form too. The last poem in the book is a sonnet, the as it stands now, which seemed like a great way into the book, but in fact it seems to me like a much better way out of the book. So I still make those kinds of changes, and I mean, I drive my poor copy editor crazy at Penguin because they're always, I changed this, you're right, that comma's probably confusing, or I ought to have a comma there, but by the way, I've added 2 more lines. I need you to put in, or I've taken out a line, and I wish you'd, will this ever stop? I think.
So, I guess we're sort of on to sort of how you organize. You move in from revision. You're always revising, but then you're also sort of moving into organizing the collection. And then, I guess once you're at that point that you've got published collections, you've got published poems. How do you kind of keep track of all this stuff? And do you do it on the computer, or do you? I mean, like before the computer, I'm sure it was a little different than it was now, but or maybe it hasn't changed at all.
I don't think it has changed at all. Okay. I mean, there was a time when I would create a file on the computer that was nothing but poems that had been published in magazines, say. And then I just got away from that and sort of went old-fashioned on myself and just started writing them down, and keeping them in the file. I don't know why I did that. It just seems like hard copies. It was a lot easier to get to the hard copies somehow and look at them and see how they, and read them than it was to call up individual poems out of a whole other file.
Yeah.
So, and to that extent, I guess I discovered that I prefer the sort of the old and seemingly laborious manual method, seriously digital, analog, not digital, analog method of notation and keeping track of things.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no doubt that for me, it's got to be a combination of the two. Even still, I mean, I've got almost all I had to scrounge around for a pen to sign their papers with, but I've got pencils all over the place because that's what I need to write in these things with.
And then your other folder there, what you call a thesis folder.
Mm-hmm.
So when did you start using those? How did that come about?
That was in Montana. Madeline DeFries gave all her students one of those, which is a very sweet thing, and I loved it. And And Rodney Jones actually talks about these things. Harvard calls them thesis binders. You can buy them in the bookstore in Harvard, but I've never come. And you can buy them in the bookstore at Montana, but I've had to order these online now. They're also called spring binders. And at Montana, when I was in graduate school, if you didn't have a spring binder to keep your poems in, you just weren't shit. You were. Where's your spring binder, man? I don't have one. Oh. So I got sort of interested in that particular thing way back then, and I've got in those boxes are hundreds of them, and I've got a couple of old ones here. That one held together with duct tape, and that's a big one. I think that's one Kim retired from a prose manuscript, so that I could do the selected poems in, because it was kind of a fatty by comparison.
Okay. How does it? I guess I'm interested. How does it work? What is it like? Does it clip in? Individual pages, or?
It's got metal in here. Ooh, this one's not. I mean, you have to squeeze it. See, this is a piece of metal in the spine. Then it's got this little.
And then it's just individual pieces of paper.
Yeah, then it's
made into a book.
Yeah, it's just a pile, and there's no particular order in this. I mean, these are all dated. There's a prose poem in stanzas.
Okay.
Which is not possible, but I did it. And then back in the back here, there's about that many poems that have already been published in, maybe a few more in journals. Yeah, quite a few more actually. But that's my filing method.
Yeah.
How I'm that's either things that have been published and therefore might be serviceable in a collection somewhere down the road, or poems that are still under construction, and then there's kind of an intermediary thing, although they're all jumbled together. I don't know which is which. I have to keep. See, I don't do this on the computer.
Yeah.
This is my submission notebook, things where I submitted things and accepted, see? That's those in 5 points. I've been doing that for years. That started in 1995, and most recently I sent a batch to, where did I send those? Well, the Georgia Review and Smithsonian wanted to see a poem, so we'll see.
So then, I guess overall, then, if we can make sure that this is working.
I hope you can hear that. Headphones.
Yeah, I'll be fine. I just all of a sudden I was like, man, I hope that's working. I didn't test it. Okay, so we're gonna go back here. So I guess so we've seen the thesis binder, and you have then like years of them over there, and those are years of notebooks and years of thesis binders. And these, how are you sort of organizing them? Are you just sort of sticking them in one place?
Yeah, they're not in any. Well, they are in a kind of order. They go most recent to most to the oldest on the bottom of the pile, but they get shuffled because I go back in and pull them out.
Okay.
I mean, it really is a kind of storage, kind of information retrieval system. It just happens to be handwritten and old-fashioned, because I love going back. I can go back 25 years and pull out a notebook and sometimes make discoveries. You know, this was interesting. How come I didn't finish this? Well, more often than not, I wasn't capable of finishing it. I'd got onto something I didn't quite have the know-how or the resourcefulness to find a way out of. And now, either I do or I've convinced myself I do. So I get it back out and go to work on it.
And then so the difference between, there's boxes as well, right?
Yeah. By the time I put stuff in boxes, that's pretty well committed to the closet, and I'm not much interested in pulling things out.
Okay.
But I do, that's one of the reasons why I have this tray down here, this wooden tray where things go in, and then I'll bring another one of those manuscript boxes out, or It usually holds 10 reams of paper, right?
Uh-huh.
Before these things, this pile of things goes into that box, I go through it poem by poem or draft by draft. I don't organize them, but I look for something. Oh yeah, I forgot about this, because sometimes I know it's on the computer somewhere, but I don't even remember it.
Mm-hmm.
And if I just go to Word and open, it's just chaos.
Right.
It's just a whole lot of files. Some of them are not called that anymore, so. But I can do a search. I can type a line and do a search and find it somewhere. But I would not even remember what it might have been called unless I find something in this batch before it goes in the box. Mm. So
okay.
I try not to lose anything, but just keeping track of it's hard.
Yeah.
I mean, I write a lot.
Right. And then we didn't talk about. I think I have some questions later, but I'd rather talk about it now. How do you name your files and your folders, and how do you organize your stuff on the computer?
Minimally.
Minimally? First line or?
Usually just a title. And sometimes I'll have, I've got, I think there's a poem called Ant. And I've got Ant 1, Ant 2, Ant 3, because I'm not sure which of those drafts I prefer. I like something about them all.
Yeah.
It may be that eventually I'll get to a final version of that poem called Ant and eliminate the others, or print them off, put them in a box, and eliminate them from the hard drive. Just get rid of them so they don't clutter up or get in the way. Mm-hmm. But I'm not all that resourceful with the computer. I think that a lot of people are much more resourceful with it as a tool. So I don't tend to do a lot of organization. It's just where I store individual poems for the most part. So there's a poem under a particular title, and that's it. Or there's a manuscript under a particular title. Although now, and this has got particularly strange, because so many magazines are accepting submissions online.
Yeah.
You find you have to assemble another file consisting of 3 or 4 or 5 poems to send, which also gets complicated too. You have this other whole set of files. So I have individual poems here. I have batches of poems that have been submitted over here, and after a while I'll just dump those because I've still got the poems.
Okay,
so I can dump
those. The poem
those.
itself is the kind of master file,
yes,
so to speak.
Yes.
Okay. And you don't ever have like Ant 2 or Ant revised or anything like that?
No, I do. When I lose track of, most of these are 2 or 3 drafts. That's number 1, number 3. Most of these are first drafts, still early on here. But you can get back in here and find like 4, 5, 7, 8. And I'll and then you go back through here and there'll be poems in which they're draft number 22, mm-hmm. And eventually once I decide that that's done and it goes into the computer as a kind of final draft, that's just the final poem as it stands there, and I'll eliminate anything else that existed along the way.
Okay.
Just to keep the old hard drive from being cluttered up.
Yeah.
And make just to make it easier to find things when I need them.
No, that's one of the bigger challenges.
Yeah.
Right, is trying to figure out what was done and how you did it then. So it's kind of bringing us to the end of this section of questions, and I want to ask I have some sort of more pointed questions about computer and use and correspondence. But I guess overall, do you see any distinct stages in your writing process? Do you see over the course of your career, do you see like distinct shifts, or do you sort of see it as a gradual change, or not change, or sort of staying the same at some point?
Well, I think there was one huge sort of shift, and that was when I moved from. Actually, when I changed publishers, my second 2 books came from the University of Illinois Press. Mm-hmm. And I had this kind of storybook thing that happened, I gave a reading at a writers' conference at which there were the president of Viking was there and the director of publicity, who is now my editor, who is famous. I mean, he edited Eat, Pray, Love. He's T.C. Boyle's editor, Paul Slovak.
Okay.
And he was there. And I gave this reading, and the president of Viking came up and said, "Do you have a book?" I said, "Well, I got to start on one. I'm working on one." He goes, "Send me what you got." I sent him 6 poems and the title of what I perceived this book.
Mm-hmm.
And 3 weeks later, I had an offer and a contract in an envelope and a delivery date. And I called and I got the delivery date extended 6 months and bingo, I was on. Well, that's sort of been the way I've worked with Penguin ever since. When I know what the book is going to be, when I have this sort of abstract but nevertheless certain sense that this is what the book is going to be, this is how it's going to work, what it's going to revolve around, this is what the title is, I send the editor an email and I say, well, this is a book it's going to be called Anatomy of Melancholy and Other Poems I'd like to deliver in spring 2012.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, he says, and then they send me a contract. I mean, it's a pretty good deal, but it's sort of a big shift because it's from that point on I have not had to worry about finding a publisher,
mm-hmm.
and that's just a great luxury. And so I can not pay attention to so much of the sort of the professional part. As I tell my students, I mean, your writing is your life, your publishing is your career.
Yeah.
You live your life, you manage your career.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes those things get so tangled up, and for some people they get tangled up, I think, much to their detriment, mm-hmm. both on the life side, maybe less so on the career side, but they get all knotted together. And not that way. I've just been lucky enough that it hasn't worked that way for me.
Right. And what book was this?
That was called In the Bank of Beautiful Sins.
Okay.
That was the first one I did with Penguin, and I've now done 6 books with them.
Yeah. And I guess my one question with that is, does it seem, I mean, I want to use the word organic here. Was it more organic when you just kind of wrote until you had a book and then presented it, or actually is it different now that you kind of know that you're guaranteed basically a publishing?
Well, yeah.
It's sort of a dumb word for this, but
No, I know what you mean. Although I think that there's something even more organic for me about having the vision of what the book is in advance, even before I've written some of the poems that are going to comprise that book, mm-hmm. Because it completely changes my focus. Once I know, I mean, people ask me now, are you working on a book? No, I'm just writing poems.
Yeah.
And that's a very serious distinction for me. And I'm not in any hurry to know what the next book is. I mean, I just published one less than a year ago, right? So April, so it's like 7 months old. So, it's going to be a year or two before I begin to have some sense. And even then I might just decide, 'cause I really don't need to be in any hurry.
Yeah.
Although Random House is now Penguin Random House. And nobody knows what that means.
Yeah.
Random House publishes Billy Collins and nobody else. Putnam publishes Linda Beards and Cornelius Eady and nobody else. Penguin's got a huge list. Knopf's got a huge list. Does one publisher need 4 poetry lists? What's going to happen?
Yeah.
So I have no control over that, so I'm just going to keep doing what I do. And if things change, bummer. Either that or not. I don't know. It might be fine.
Yeah.
But I do think that it really has been, and it was that first incidence of saying, I got this great opportunity. Penguin wants to publish a book of mine. I can make this move to a New York house, and I don't have a book manuscript yet. But if I can promise to have this book manuscript called this at such and such a date. I'll have it. And it worked so well for me. I mean, my first 3 books for Penguin all won prizes. Then it cooled off. They still love me, but still. I need to win another prize, I guess. Doing the best I can.
That's an interesting point. That sort of professional becoming. I mean, is it when you have those deadlines? Is it in some ways just that much more generative? I mean, you can't really have a block.
No, no, and you know, my colleague Brandon Schran says there's no such thing as writer's block. If you call a plumber, he's not going to tell you, I got plumber's block, I can't help you. We ought to be able to be as professional about it as a plumber is. I mean, that's facetious, of course, but I you know, Bill Stafford always used to say, if you can't write, lower your standards. And that's actually tremendously good advice, too, because you lower your standards and it can open up in so many different ways. You don't really lower your standards. You quit trying to second guess yourself. Yeah. You quit sitting down and trying to write a great poem, because that's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. So this sort of last group of questions is more specifically about computers, and some of it's going to be repetitive. So if you've answered most of it, you don't need to go more, but just do me the favor of repeating yourself if you don't mind. So I think we can answer some of this. You began using computers on a regular basis.
Mid-90s.
Mid-90s, and was that you started using them basically just for like almost as a typewriter, and then how did that sort of change? Did you start? Were there like things that it became part of your life that you did more with the computer?
I really did not start actively composing sometimes the bulk of the poem, and occasionally, this has not happened too very often, that prose poem I just pointed out, that prose poem in stanzas, had to be composed on the computer, the whole of it. By which I mean I set the margins, and and allowed the word processing program to determine where the ends of the lines were. But that also required that I not sort of run the line on too far before I began what I felt was another stanza. So my students accuse me of hating prose poems. I don't hate prose poems. I just don't see the point. Which is probably ignorant of me. There are prose poems I love, but yet I've never really been interested in writing one until I sort of gave myself this challenge. What if I allowed the computer to determine where the lines end, but still found a way to make its structure appear as though it were verse and not prose? Yeah. And that's so that's what I did. I think, however, when I first started trying to compose or do the bulk of the composition on the computer was after I was in this little space, which probably would have been somewhere around 2000, late aughts, 2008 maybe. And I started out just on a kind of lark. What happened if I come out here and sit down and make a poem in lines on the word processor? And the first, I don't know, I think I was on sabbatical then too, as I am now. That would have been 2007. And I didn't have much luck. I didn't have much luck making actual poems until all of a sudden I did. Yeah. And that's when I decided to sort of convert myself to part-time writing longhand and part-time writing on the computer. And I've been very comfortable with that ever since. So
about 2007.
About 2007, I think that's when I really got started on it.
And so you're sort of talking about this, but I guess, are there any sort of techniques or formats that you were able to? Well, you sort of said this, but I guess okay. The more sort of pressing question: do you think you're using the computer has given you advantages over previous styles of writing? And conversely, what sort of disadvantages do you see it?
I don't see any disadvantages, really. I have, sort of worries about what it might do. But at this point, I can't quite bring myself to go back, mainly because it seems like I'm having good luck. And part of that may just be that I've gotten to that point in my life or my career as a writer. Or I know a lot of tricks. I know how to trick myself. I know how to get going. I know how to get out of a lot of tight spaces. I know how to surprise myself, or how to do those things that might lead me to surprise myself. And I can do that on the computer, and I can do that I can get somewhere faster. Or so it seems. Mm-hmm. It might be an illusion, but I don't think that it is. If there is a disadvantage, I don't have. Well, let me grab one of these. I don't know when this was. 1996. But you can see I don't do. Look how neat that is. There's not a lot of. But there's a little bit more crossing out and stuff. I don't know what this is. There's a big chunk cut, and sometimes there's a little bit more, but and all of those kinds of things. But I don't. The major revisions even here probably began when I started converting to the there's Nix 9. When I started converting it to a typewritten document.
Yeah.
But I miss this sometimes. And I go back and look and think, God, how cool is this? This is sort of an interesting thing to have, and I'm not producing this anymore.
Yeah.
And that,
yeah,
I worry about that. Right. I think, and no one knows, and if you're if you're writing in hopes that your poems will last, that makes you pretty normal, but there's no guarantee that. Right. You don't know. Everybody hopes that they might write something that might last, but you just don't know. You just do the best you can. But if there's a point at which one's work draws the attention of some kind of a scholar or somebody who's willing to study what you've done, documents like that are going to be really, really interesting because it was put on the page by the hand of the poet rather than just ignited electronically.
No, and there's no thought being sort of expressed on the electronic side.
No, you can. Some of the my own marginalia on my own poems.
Yeah.
There's a big question mark, but then there's other times there's like notes, tools. Yeah. I just saw a couple of others. Egad. I'll just pick it up. And I don't know what that says. I don't have my glasses on. But yeah, making notes to myself. Sometimes notes in frustration.
Yeah.
This is idiotic.
Right.
Oh, I gotta see what this says. What I did with my glasses. Jesus. Oh yeah, Jesus just saw a truck get hit by the train.
Oh wow. Wait, Jesus did?
Oh, I did.
Okay.
Jesus as in Jesus.
You got somebody in one of your
an understood subject.
Christ, don't you? So.
Oh yeah, well yeah. Well, there's Lucifer Doolin.
Right.
Yeah, when hit his brother Jesus Christ, who was born dead. But
that makes more sense. Right?
Yes.
So I guess this is a sort of simple, maybe an overly simple, but does the internet play a role in any of your writing practices? Is that connected to the internet?
Yeah, when I built the thing in 2002, I put an Ethernet cable, buried an Ethernet cable out. So I am wired out here, but I try to not stay connected very often because it's such an easy distraction. On the other hand, Kim and I enjoyed Scotland so much. I've been trying to get her to apply to go to the castle at Hawthorne, and Rochelle has been there.
Oh yeah.
But then it turns out you can't. They don't want you to go as a couple, and there's no internet. And Kim said, forget it, because she's a prose writer,
Yeah.
and she said, so much of her. Oh, the NSA must have a file 5 feet thick on her because she wrote a novel about. She's downloaded maps of all the oil fields and pipelines in the Middle East.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
of course they're watching her. But all that came through the internet. So,
Right.
I mean, it's a useful thing, and I still use it every now and then. And if I do wind up submitting a poem, I just sent a poem, right before we left for the UK, to Paul Muldoon,
Mm-hmm.
and the New York. It's the only way to submit to the New Yorker is electronically. They're not interested in paper anymore.
Yeah, I mean all the manuscript contests now are almost exclusive.
Yeah, and that's good somehow.
Yeah, it makes it a lot easier for everyone, I think.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. It's. I mean, it. I don't worry about the book disappearing and going to ebooks much,
Mm-hmm.
and if it does, all these books of mine are going to be worth a fortune. So that's the way I look at it.
So I guess we sort of talked about this, but when do you consider a piece of writing finished? Do you, and has this machine changed your sort of opinion on that regard?
I think that it's just the same as a typewritten document. I don't consider anything complete until I print it off and then set it off into the world. But when I did the selected poems, both here and in the UK, I made some changes, not big changes, but I made some changes here and there in poems. So I don't consider them sacred ever. But mostly, when I'm ready to put it in a book, it's finished.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to mess with it anymore.
And that's it.
Because I'm not, I had this talk with Terrence Hayes, whom I've known for a long time, since he was never a wee boy. He's 9 foot tall anyway, but he didn't want to read poems out of books at Aldeburgh, and we were both in England with Dennis Nirksey and Katha Pollitt. They were the 4 Americans there. And I said, I know what you mean. I said, but I got this Brit book. I've got to read from the book because the publisher's here. He wants to move copies. And he goes, yeah, you're right. He doesn't have a British publisher, so they shipped Penguin books over there. And he goes, I want people to buy them, otherwise they got to ship them all back. So he had to read poems from the books. And as he said to me, and I understand this absolutely, at readings, I'm not really interested in reading those poems.
Yeah.
It's like once that book's out there, run along. I'm interested in reading and sharing what I'm working on and sort of testing it in reading situations.
How do you feel about the security and fixity of your files? I mean, you have the backup. Does that pretty much alleviate most of your worries, or you don't?
Well, yeah, I did. On this bookshelf here, there's a little piece of wood that functions as a book stop.
Uh-huh.
And I didn't used to have that. I had a big marble bookend, which I was sitting like this, had my feet on the hassock. I was reading and I heard something go slide. And I just turned just to see this 12-pound marble bookend just crush my laptop.
Wow.
I managed to get the hard drive out and retrieve everything. The hard drive was fine. It didn't hurt. It just killed the mechanism.
Yeah.
So I'm not too worried about it. And then I also print things off relentlessly. I mean, every time I get through a draft, which is why I fill up so many cartons of paper. North Texas, those people who buy so many piles of writers' papers, especially Western writers, pay by the pound. So, are you kidding me? You ain't going to pay me anything for my electronic files. No, I'm printing this off. So, and paper's heavy.
That's funny. So I guess you talked about having an external hard drive before. What was that process like? And were you more concerned about crashes and whatnot in the earlier days of computers?
I think I was. I'm less concerned with the Mac.
Yeah.
Somehow it seems, I never have any issues with it. Whereas PCs sometimes seemed kind of odd, or they'd be afflicted by some bug.
Yeah.
And so that worried me. So I had this 3/4 terabyte hard drive that every time I came out here, I just plug it in, and it was on automatic backup. And it backed up all my photographs as well as music and mostly all my files. While it was plugged in, it would back up every hour. It would just back up all my Word files. And I've still got that. I'd have to plug it into it won't work on the Mac. I'd have to plug it into a PC somewhere. I don't even know. It's out here somewhere.
Yeah.
And every now and then I think I need to go buy an external drive for the Mac too, just so I can back things up that way. But then I don't. Because I do have a lot of paper.
Right.
And I got stuff in the cloud, and I got stuff in Mozy. So I feel pretty sanguine about the possibilities of me being able to retrieve something. Now, if a forest fire rips through and I'm gone and it burns up the computer and all my boxes of poems and everything, then it's Mozy or the cloud.
Yeah.
And
wow.
That's it.
That is the sort of...
And every place in the woods in this part of Idaho burns.
Right.
It's not if, it's when.
Yeah.
And hasn't been here in a long time, but could be next July or August or September or October.
Yeah.
Which concerns me. Yes, that does concern me, and I'd especially like to move all those boxes out of the closet, get the right offer.
Your closet too.
Well, yeah, I should. I need a vault.
Yeah. Okay, so I have just a few more questions. I want to talk a little bit about correspondence and then a little bit about teaching. So do you correspond much now with other writers?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess we'll talk about teaching a little bit. But.
I do, and I miss. Well, let's see. I got that's a letter from Phil Levine.
Oh,
He wrote me because I wrote him, and I've got a file in there, probably 1.5 inches thick of letters from Phil Levine. That's almost all letters.
Okay.
But I probably write 10 letters, 12 letters a year now. And I've got a few people who are really willing correspondents and write back. They still like the idea of letters.
Yeah.
And I do too. I love getting the letter. It's not like getting an email.
Yeah.
But most of the correspondence is via email anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And I try to print those off. I've got I think I've got 2 or 3 letters from Billy Collins. I've known Billy for a long time too, but our correspondence over the last decade has been entirely electronic.
Okay.
All these abbreviated little snippets, which are hilarious,
Yeah.
because he's very funny, tremendously witty, and he's especially good in letters too, as well as in poems, and so we have a great deal of fun. But there are all these little short snippets, which I find myself compelled to come out and print off the whole thread of the thing, one email at a time, this much on a page, that long. But I want to save those things,
right.
And something about saving them electronically doesn't seem like saving them on paper.
Yeah. When did email start to become the sort of primary mode of correspondence?
Probably around the turn of the millennium, I think, for me. And it was so exciting at first, the idea of being able to communicate so quickly.
Yeah.
But then you realize what's missing. I mean, I can go back and look at. I got letters from Gwendolyn Brooks. I've got letters from James Dickey, Richard Hugo. I've got this wonderful file of letters, which if a forest fire burns through, they're gone too. What am I thinking? Anyway.
Bring those in.
But I do. The communications. A lot of the communications. I've got a file on one of my 2 email addresses. I get a lot of writerly emails on the U of I account because that's the easiest one to find.
Right.
I've got a Gmail account that I just kind of keep private. That's my business file, and my personal file or my personal email. So I save all those communications from other poets, other writers, but I don't print all of them off.
Yeah.
Some I do. Some seem important enough to print off. Others don't.
Okay. And that's your like kind of line of something that you kind of hold dear and then you print.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, if I get a particularly great letter,
yeah.
Published a poem in the New Yorker. Well, it's in that issue up there, the Obama issue with the O over
yeah.
the Lincoln Memorial. And I've never had a response to a poem like that. What's the poem called? It's in Beautiful Country. Shit. What is it called? Exxon.
Oh, yeah.
And I got 140 some odd emails from a lot of people I know, a lot of poets I know of but don't really know, and a lot of strangers, vets, amputees, just, all of them positive, nobody, nothing. And all of that stuff, I printed off. I got a whole file just of those kinds of things, just to have that kind of response to a poem. I mean, you got to save that in hard copy, I guess is what I'm saying. I couldn't just leave those sort of loose on the net in the
because they're not. Yeah.
Right. I mean, they're probably no more permanent now, given that I live in the place that's likely to burn in a forest fire. But they seem that way to me now, and it's easy enough to look at them if I should want to, which I have not. But
did you have any experiences like that? I mean, I'm assuming that was New Yorker with all that exposure. But did you have like letters come to you when you were younger and there was not email? I mean, did that happen?
Oh yeah. I mean, I've got a couple of files in there that's just called fan mail, where you get letters from people you don't know.
Yeah.
But also sometimes I think that's the difference between the two files. Is one is people I know who send me terrific poem and such, or then poems from complete strangers. I got another pile called Crank, where I've gotten like 4 or 5 anonymous letters from some person who hates me in Boise, and is always, I don't know what's up with that. But I really kind of I'm delighted by them. I can always tell there's no return address. It's Boise. Oh, it's that asshole again. Look at what do you got to say this time?
Wow.
Yeah. Well, Phil Levine. I told Phil Levine about it, and he said, "Well, you're getting somewhere if people hate you."
Yeah. So has your style of like writing these correspondences, once email became part of it, did it change your letter writing too, or
Well, it made letter writing almost go away. I mean, I wrote a lot of letters. Letters were kind of the way I warmed up when I would get into my writing space. Here or in Lenore, I had another shack very similar to this, and that was how I warmed up. I'd write a letter to somebody, sometimes with my mom. But most often it was just another poet friend. I'd write him a letter, talk to him about poems, maybe send him a couple of poems. And when email came along, that sort of, there's something about putting a poem as an attachment to send to somebody that seems more like a violation. If you put it folded in an envelope with a letter, it's much more friendlier, intimate kind of gesture than email is.
Yeah, I kind of I understand what you're saying, but I also, it's surprising because in some ways that should make it that much more easily available to you to write your friends and send poems.
Well, and as of course it does. I mean, when in the last few times I have sent poems off to other people, I think I sent some to David Baker a few years ago, just to get some feedback on, and I sent those email. Last time I sent poems to anybody else to look at who was not Kim, I think I sent them email. So it's very easy to do that. It's convenient, but it isn't as intimate, and I suppose, or it doesn't seem as intimate. Why is it any less intimate?
Right.
I don't have a shade on this window. All right.
It's okay. I'll do it. I didn't actually ask you one question. I was interested in your sort of routine. Like, do you come out here in the mornings and I mean, is there like set times or is it whenever? Or what's your...
Well, it's mostly whenever I can. I've got, I have long days. I teach Tuesdays and Thursdays. When I took this job, that was my understanding. My teaching schedule will be Tuesday and Thursday. So I teach Tuesdays and Thursdays. I'm usually in by 9. I almost always have a night class, so I don't leave so I put in like 12, 13 hours on campus Tuesday and Thursday. Wednesday tends to be my campus day when I'm on just doing regular office hours, and hopefully if I'm on a committee I can get them to schedule meetings on Wednesday. If they don't want to do Wednesday, I'll do Friday, but I'd rather have theoretically Monday and Friday. That's when I write.
Right.
And so I get out here by between 9 and 10. It varies, depends on what else is going on through the year. And, if it's cold weather, I build a fire, get it warmed up, maybe do a little email work to catch up, and then get started and go in for lunch about noonish, 12:30, between 12:30 and 1, come back out and stay till about 5. And that's pretty much been my routine really for a long time now, for 20 years.
Yeah.
And it's a pretty good way to work. I mean,
right.
it's a luxury to have time. It's an even greater luxury to be on sabbatical, or as I envision it when I retire, permanent sabbatical.
Yeah.
We'll see about that. See how that works.
So I guess the last sort of question is that, with teaching and the sort of advent of the computer coming into your teaching, how did that sort of change your day-to-day life? I mean, there's much more access to you, but there's also sort of more barriers. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Well, it on the negative side, yeah, you're available. You're sort of at the end of this electronic tether.
Yeah.
So you can't get away from students that way. But, my students tend to be pretty aware of what I'm up to. And but there's certain things they just got to know about. And sometimes, they, can we meet tomorrow? I know you're coming. I know you got office hours. I don't. If you got any time between 2 and 3, if I can stop by, could we look at these 2 poems? And there's an attachment with a couple of poems. And that's both the downside that they don't have to call you, they don't have to make an appointment or come by, they can just ask you, and there you are at home, and you respond, and I do. It's also great though because they can do that, and it's a whole lot more convenient than sure I got the poems now, I can read them tonight, I'll talk to you about them tomorrow, come in at 2:30. So it's both. Mostly I think it's positive. Mostly I think it's good. I'm on sabbatical. Kim's not on sabbatical. She worked out being gone for 13 days while we went to the UK.
Yeah.
All she did, when we were in Aldeburgh, all she did was correspondence with her students. I mean, she was doing it we were there for 4 days. She did that nothing but, and she never did get to see much of Aldeburgh because of that.
Yeah.
But and everybody else at the festival thought my wife was a myth because she only came out once. But
do you think, do you see like this sort of, call them what you will, but the more computer adept and those who've been raised digital natives or whatever, have they sort of changed your relationship to computers? Have they sort of, their sort of comfort and use of it, has that sort of, done anything to your own teaching or your own sort of writing in that way?
Teaching may be insofar as what I love, especially in graduate classes, especially in things like the techniques class, which I'm teaching in the spring, in which we'll be talking about a different volume of contemporary poetry every week, and we'll have a good 2.5, 3 hour discussion about this book of poems, how the book works, how the individual poems work, how this particular poet does his or her work. And it'll be great, it'll be invigorating, and I'll come home and I'll immediately think of like 37 different things I should have said, or ways to connect things that they said, and sort of bind our conversation together. And the email, I'll just do a class email and just with bullets and say, here's this and this and this and this, and I can add 2 or 3 links to things they need to consider. I remember that was one of the great things about the internet. I taught, I don't even remember what the class was called. It was an American Lit class, English 570, so Studies in American and English Literature, I think it was, but anyway, 20th century. And I taught Hart Crane, taught the bridge, and they both despised Hart Crane because it's not easy, and it's a failed epic, God bless him. But we had a wonderful discussion about what qualifies as failure and ambition and so forth. And I was able to send them the follow-up email that tried to bind the class discussion together with all sorts of references and links to other things they could read about Crane.
Yeah.
Which I think was a great so it's a great pedagogical tool that way then.
Right. I think I've exhausted it.
Oh.
Unless you have any other. I mean, I guess Well, I think we've covered pretty much everything I want to cover.
Okay.
We have a good sense of your writing process. Is there anything that you do? I mean, you're writing letters in the earlier part of your career to get warmed up was sort of interesting to me. And what do you do anything specifically to get warmed up now? Do you read?
Actually, I write sonnets.
You write sonnets.
Yeah, I mean, I probably have 100 sonnets. I think I've published 2 in books.
Uh-huh.
But I love the form, and the form is very friendly to me. And they're mostly sort of hybridized. I like the Italian octave. I like ABBA, ABBA. And then a kind of Shakespearean couplet at the end, or at least a kind of coupleted rhyme at the end. Mm-hmm. And I'll sit down and I'll spend the first 2 hours just kind of messing around with a sonnet.
Yeah.
And I don't really need, it's like with a sonnet, I don't need an idea. I just start putting words on paper. Mm-hmm. It'll have to do with the frost. It'll have to do with, is it still there? Oh, I think it fell down. It was an enormous, yeah, it did. I think it's gone anyway. I can't see. There's a paper, bald-faced hornet's nest about this big around up in the tree. Yeah. And I think I got 3 or 4 what I call wind sprint sonnets out of that thing, just looking up at that and watching the hornets go in and out. Yeah. Which at some point this winter I need to take the shotgun out and blast out of the tree, otherwise, because next year it'll be this big. So I don't want that.
No. Where do you write those down in a notebook, or are they?
Oh no, I just sat down on the computer and started writing down. Those are like, computer. Yeah, because it loosens me up, gets things going, and sometimes I'll get halfway into one, or I'll get 13 lines into one, and then I'll feel sort of desperation, and I'll just finish it off somehow. It rhymes, and it's not a successful poem. Like I said, I've only used, if I've got 100, I've used 2. Yeah. But it gets the wheels turning, and then I can turn here and I can start writing down lines, and it's often, not always, but some phrase or word out of that little sonnet wind sprint, as I called it, will be what? Oh wait, there's like a real poem in that phrase, and so I'll start from that. It's great fun too. I do love sonnets. I should probably try to find them all. No, I won't. It's in the boxes, and the boxes, and the boxes.
The future scholars.
Yeah, let them see if you can find them and see how many of them don't suck. I think there's 2.
There's 2, maybe. Well, no, thank you very much.
Oh, well, it was my pleasure, Devin. It's great to get to meet you. And
yeah. I'm sorry I'm so reclusive, I guess.
Oh, no, it's okay. You got like a job and stuff too.
Yeah,
so.
I do. I'm 95 and all that. Now we just pray that all the electronics work.
Yeah. Well, we've gotten so good at relying on them, you know.
Yeah. Okay. So if I can use your outdoor urinal.
It's right in this corner. It's a black funnel. You'll see it. You can't miss it.
And I'm going to take a few photographs to document this.
Sure.